November 21st, 1942. 8:47 in the morning. General Friedrich Paulus sat at a field table inside his forward command post at Golyabinskaya, 10 miles north of Kalik on the Don River. The radio message from Army Group B headquarters had arrived 17 minutes earlier. 6 words that redefined the parameters of survival for 250,000 men. 6th Army will stand fast regardless of danger of temporary encirclement. The order carried Adolf Hitler's authority. Paulus read it twice. Then he looked up at the operations map spread across the table. Red arrows marked Soviet tank columns driving south from Serafimovich. Other red arrows pushed north from Beketovka. The 2 Soviet thrusts were 120 kilometers apart yesterday morning. This morning they were perhaps 60 kilometers apart. Tomorrow, if the advance continued at its current velocity, they would meet somewhere near Kalik. Paulus was 47 years old. He had spent his entire military career as a staff officer, trained in planning and logistics, comfortable with maps and supply tables and the mathematics of warfare. He had never commanded troops in combat until January of this year, when he took control of 6th Army. Since August, his forces had been fighting for Stalingrad, grinding through the city block by block. By early November, they controlled 90% of the ruins. Then on November 19th, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, attacking the Romanian armies, protecting 6th Army's flanks with overwhelming force. The Romanian 3rd Army to the northwest collapsed within hours. The Romanian 4th Army to the south broke apart on November 20th. Soviet mechanized columns poured through the gaps. Paulus had requested permission to withdraw from Stalingrad yesterday. The request had been denied. Now Hitler ordered him to stand fast. Paulus folded the message and placed it in his jacket pocket. Outside the command post, Soviet tanks were visible on the western horizon. Reconnaissance reported they were moving southeast toward Kalik, not toward his headquarters. That would change if they realized how close they were to 6th Army's command structure. Paulus gave the order to evacuate to Nizhny Cherskaya, 60 kilometers to the southwest, where 6th Army's winter headquarters had been constructed behind the Chur River. The evacuation began at noon. By 1400 hours, Soviet armored reconnaissance units reached the outskirts of Golyabinskaya. The 14 Panzer Corps staff, which had moved into the abandoned command post, engaged them with elements of the 14th and 16th Panzer Divisions. The Soviet columns ignored the resistance and continued southeast. Their objective was not German headquarters. It was Kalik and the bridge over the Don. At 05:30 on November 22nd, a battalion from the Soviet XXVI Tank Corps captured the Don Bridge at Kalik intact. By 1600 hours that afternoon, forward elements of the Soviet 4th Tank Corps, advancing from the south, made contact with units of the Soviet 4th Mechanized Corps near the village of Savitsky. The encirclement was complete. 6th Army, elements of 4th Panzer Army, and portions of 2 Romanian corps, approximately 290,000 men, were trapped in a pocket measuring roughly 40 kilometers west to east and 30 kilometers north to south. Paulus received confirmation of the encirclement at 1815. He immediately assembled his corps commanders at the Nizhny Cherskaya headquarters. The commanders arrived throughout the evening. General Hans-Valentin Hube, commanding 14 Panzer Corps. General Karl Strecker, commanding 11 Corps. General Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commanding LI Corps. General Erwin Janek, commanding 4 Corps. General Friedrich Wilhelm von Chapuis, commanding LI Army Corps Artillery. They gathered in a room heated by a single stove. The temperature outside was minus 15 degrees Celsius. Inside, condensation froze on the walls. Paulus stood at the map table. The encirclement was marked in red pencil, a rough oval containing most of what remained of Sixth Army's combat strength. The discussion that followed was not recorded by stenographers. It was later reconstructed from the memories of participants, primarily General Hube and staff officers present in adjacent rooms. Seydlitz-Gersbach spoke first. His position was straightforward. The army must break out immediately before the Soviet forces surrounding them could consolidate their positions. Every hour delayed meant stronger Soviet defenses, fewer German supplies, and reduced chances of success. He estimated they had fuel sufficient for a 30-kilometer advance. The Soviet encirclement ring was thin. A concentrated breakout to the southwest, coordinated with a relief attack from outside forces, could succeed. But it must begin within 24 hours. Hube supported this assessment. He commanded the Panzer Corps, the only force capable of spearheading a breakout. His tanks and vehicles had enough fuel for limited operations. His units still maintained combat effectiveness, but he emphasized the time constraint. Fuel consumption during static defensive operations was minimal. A breakout would exhaust their remaining reserves. If they were going to attempt it, immediate action was essential. Janek agreed with Seydlitz-Gersbach and Hube. His four corps held positions along the southern edge of the pocket. He reported that Soviet forces in that sector were still reorganizing after their rapid advance. A breakout directed southwest toward Kotelnikovo offered the best terrain and the weakest enemy resistance. His corps could lead the assault if ordered. Strecker was more cautious. His 11 Corps held the northern positions, the farthest from any potential breakout route. A withdrawal and reorganization of his forces would take days. During that period, his sector would be vulnerable to Soviet attack. He did not oppose a breakout, but he noted the complexity of extracting his units while maintaining defensive integrity. Shapu is focused on artillery. A breakout required mobile artillery support. His guns could not be abandoned. Moving them required vehicles and fuel. Many of his tractors were immobilized by lack of fuel or mechanical failure. He could guarantee artillery support for a short, sharp assault, but not for a sustained fighting withdrawal. Paulus listened to each commander. He did not interrupt. When they finished, he pulled a message from his pocket and read it aloud. Sixth Army will stand fast regardless of danger of temporary encirclement. The order was explicit. Hitler expected Sixth Army to maintain its positions around Stalingrad. Withdrawal was not authorized. Seydlitz-Gersbach's response was documented by multiple witnesses. He stated that Hitler's order was based on incorrect assumptions about the tactical situation. The encirclement was not temporary. Soviet forces were not capable of immediate resupply by air. Sixth Army would be destroyed if it remained in position. The only rational course of action was immediate breakout. Obeying Hitler's order would result in the annihilation of the army. Paulus replied that he understood the argument. He also understood the consequences of disobeying a direct order from the Supreme Commander. He stated that he would request permission to break out. Until that permission was granted, Sixth Army would comply with existing directives. The meeting ended at 22:15. No decision was made to initiate a breakout. Paulus drafted a message to Army Group B headquarters requesting authorization to withdraw from Stalingrad. The message emphasized the immediate danger, the limited time available for action, and the deteriorating supply situation. It was transmitted at 23:40. At 22:15, before Paulus had even drafted his request, Hitler sent a second message. It arrived at 6th Army headquarters at 10:15 on November 23rd. The message reiterated the stand-fast order and added a promise. Relief forces were being assembled. Hermann Göring had guaranteed that the Luftwaffe could supply 6th Army by air. The army would hold Stalingrad until relieved. Paulus read this message to his staff at 11 o'clock. He did not comment on Göring's guarantee. Several staff officers did. They calculated that 6th Army required 300 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. The Luftwaffe had never sustained an airlift of that magnitude under combat conditions. The distance from German airfields to Stalingrad was 200 kilometers. Soviet air defenses controlled most of that airspace. Weather conditions in winter made flight operations unpredictable. The airlift would fail. Paulus acknowledged these observations. Then he repeated that Hitler had ordered the army to hold its positions. A relief force was being organized. Until that relief force arrived, or until Hitler authorized a breakout, 6th Army would defend. The staff officers present understood what this meant. Paulus was not going to disobey Hitler, not to save his army, not to prevent a catastrophe everyone in the room could see developing. He would follow orders until the orders changed or until following them became physically impossible. On November 24th, the first Luftwaffe transport aircraft arrived at Potomac Airfield inside the pocket. They delivered 17 tons of supplies. 6th Army consumed approximately 300 tons that day. The shortfall was 283 tons. This deficit would accumulate every day the airlift continued. On November 25th, Paulus flew out of the pocket to meet with General Maximilian von Wakes, commander of Army Group B. Wakes could not authorize a breakout. That authority rested with Hitler. Wakes agreed that a breakout was militarily necessary. He stated that he supported Paulus's position and would recommend to Hitler that the stand-fast order be rescinded. He could not promise Hitler would agree. Paulus returned to 6th Army headquarters that evening. He brought with him several cases of wine and champagne. Officers who witnessed these supplies being unloaded interpreted them as evidence that Paulus accepted the inevitability of a long siege. Others believed it was denial, an attempt to maintain normal routines in an abnormal situation. On November 26th, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein arrived at Novichorsk to assume command of the newly created Army Group Dawn. Manstein had been recalled from operations on the Leningrad front specifically to resolve the Stalingrad crisis. His orders were to restore the southern front and relieve 6th Army. Manstein was considered the most capable field commander in the German army. If anyone could extract Paulus from the encirclement, it was Manstein. Manstein's first action was to review the supply situation. On November 26th, Luftwaffe General Martin Fiebig flew into the pocket to assess conditions and returned with a detailed report. 6th Army had rations for 12 days at reduced consumption rates. Ammunition stocks were at 10 to 20% of normal levels, enough for 1 day of intensive combat. Vehicle fuel was sufficient for minor movements within the pocket, but insufficient to concentrate forces for a breakout. The Army's 10,000 horses were being slaughtered for food. The soldiers were already weakening. Manstein read this report and concluded that immediate breakout was no longer feasible. The Army lacked the fuel and ammunition to fight its way through Soviet lines. Any attempt would result in the Army being destroyed in the open steppe exposed to Soviet artillery and armor with no supplies, no shelter, and no capacity for sustained combat. But he also concluded that the longer Sixth Army remained in the pocket, the weaker it would become. If a relief operation was going to succeed, it had to begin immediately, and it had to be coordinated with limited offensive action by Sixth Army to reduce the distance relief forces would need to travel. On November 26th, the same day Manstein received Fiebig's report, Paulus wrote a letter to Manstein describing the tactical situation. The letter was flown out of the pocket that evening. In it, Paulus stated that he had received no orders or information from higher command for 36 hours. He faced two options. He could remain in position as ordered and watch his western and northern fronts collapse as Soviet forces attacked from the rear. Or he could turn his forces to engage the Soviet troops that were rolling up his defensive lines, which would require abandoning Stalingrad and attempting a breakout to the southwest. Paulus wrote that both options violated his orders in different ways. Remaining in place meant formal compliance with Hitler's directive, but resulted in the army's destruction. Breaking out meant saving the army, but disobeying Hitler for the second time. He requested clarity. He requested freedom of action. Manstein did not have authority to grant that freedom. Hitler maintained direct control of Sixth Army through a liaison officer stationed at Paulus's headquarters with his own communications section. Any order Paulus issued would be reported to Hitler immediately. If Paulus ordered a breakout without authorization, Hitler would relieve him of command and replace him with an officer who would obey. Manstein understood this. He also understood that Paulus would not act without orders. Paulus was a staff officer, trained in a system that valued obedience and discipline above initiative. He would not seize authority he did not possess. He would not make decisions that contradicted his instructions. He would wait for orders that clarified his situation and told him what to do. Those orders never came. On November 27th, Hitler confirmed the Stand-Fast Directive. Sixth Army would hold Stalingrad. Relief was coming. The Luftwaffe would provide supplies. Manstein would break the encirclement from outside. Paulus would hold until Manstein arrived. Manstein began planning Operation Winter Storm, a relief operation that would employ forces from 4th Panzer Army to drive northeast towards Stalingrad and establish a supply corridor. The operation was scheduled to begin in mid-December, giving Manstein time to assemble sufficient forces. In the meantime, Sixth Army would defend and survive on air-delivered supplies. The airlift failed from the beginning. On November 27th, the Luftwaffe delivered 47 tons. On November 28th, 51 tons. On November 29th, 39 tons. Weather interfered. Soviet fighters shot down transport aircraft. Airfields within the pocket became congested with damaged planes. The daily average throughout December never exceeded 70 tons. Sixth Army required 300. Soldiers were placed on 1/3 rations. They began slaughtering and eating horses. By December 7th, the daily bread ration was 1 loaf divided among 5 men. Soldiers scavenged the frozen ruins of Stalingrad for anything edible. Medical supplies ran out. Wounded men froze in unheated bunkers because there was no fuel for stoves. Throughout this period, Paulus maintained defensive positions as ordered. He did not authorize a breakout. He did not reduce the perimeter to shorten supply lines. He followed Hitler's directive to hold all ground and await relief. On December 12th, Manstein launched Operation Winter Storm. 4th Panzer Army, spearheaded by LVI Panzer Corps under Hermann Hoth, attacked northeast from Kotelnikovo toward the Mishkova River. The advance covered 30 kilometers in the first 24 hours. By December 18th, German forces were within 48 kilometers of 6th Army's positions. Hoth radioed Manstein that he could advance no further without support. Soviet reserves were arriving. His flanks were threatened. If 6th Army did not attack south to link up, the relief force would be destroyed. Manstein sent orders to Paulus. Prepare Operation Thunderclap. Begin withdrawing forces from Stalingrad. Attack south to meet 4th Panzer Army. Break the encirclement. Paulus received these orders at 1800 hours on December 19th. He convened his corps commanders. The discussion was brief. Fuel stocks were sufficient for a 30-kilometer advance at most. The distance to Hoth's forces was 48 kilometers. The army could not reach them. Even if they could, they had no fuel reserves for further operations. Breaking out meant abandoning all heavy equipment, all immobile wounded, and marching through sub-zero temperatures with no shelter and minimal supplies. Hube argued for the attempt anyway. Staying meant certain destruction. Attempting a breakout offered a chance, however small. Other commanders agreed. The army was dying by degrees. A breakout might kill them faster, but at least they would die fighting rather than freezing and starving in defensive positions. Paulus listened to the arguments. Then he stated his decision. Hitler had not authorized Thunderclap. Manstein's orders were preparatory, not executive. Until Hitler explicitly ordered the breakout, 6th Army would remain in position. Several officers questioned this interpretation. Manstein's orders seemed clear. Paulus disagreed. Manstein could not countermand Hitler. If Paulus initiated Thunderclap without Hitler's authorization, Hitler would halt the operation and relieve Paulus of command. The attempt would fail not because it was militarily impossible, but because it would be stopped by German command structure. On December 23rd, Soviet forces launched Operation Little Saturn, attacking the Italian 8th Army northwest of the Don. The Italians collapsed. Soviet mechanized forces drove toward Rostov, threatening to encircle Army Group A in the Caucasus and cut off Manstein's entire army group. Hoth's relief force was pulled back to defend against this new threat. Operation Winter Storm was terminated. 6th Army was no longer going to be relieved. But Paulus had not been told this directly. On December 24th, he requested permission from Hitler to break out while retreat was still possible. Hitler's response arrived on December 25th. 6th Army would hold Stalingrad. No withdrawal was authorized. By early January 1943, 6th Army was combat ineffective. Soldiers were receiving 150 grams of bread and 70 grams of meat per day. Thousands were dying from starvation and cold. Units reported they could no longer hold their positions. Soviet forces tightened the pocket. On January 8th, Soviet command sent surrender terms under a flag of truce. Paulus forwarded the terms to Hitler with a request for guidance. Hitler ordered him to reject the surrender offer and continue fighting. On January 10th, the Soviet Army launched Operation Ring, a coordinated assault to destroy 6th Army piece by piece. Soviet artillery saturated German positions. Infantry advanced behind tanks. The pocket began to collapse from west to east. On January 22nd, Soviet forces captured Potomac Airfield. The last supply flights ceased. On January 26th, Soviet troops split the pocket in two, isolating Paulus's headquarters in the southern sector from Strecker's forces in the north. On January 30th, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal and sent him a message noting that no German field marshal had ever been captured alive. The implication was obvious. Paulus was expected to commit suicide rather than surrender. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered his headquarters and the southern pocket to Soviet forces. Strecker's northern pocket held until February 2nd before also surrendering. Over 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. An estimated 150,000 had died during the siege. The decision to stand fast at Stalingrad destroyed 6th Army. The order was issued on November 21st, 1942. Every senior officer in 6th Army knew it was wrong from the moment they received it. They knew the encirclement was not temporary. They knew airlift could not sustain the army. They knew that remaining in position guaranteed destruction. They knew that immediate breakout offered the only chance of survival. But the German military system did not reward officers who disobeyed orders, even wrong orders. It rewarded obedience, discipline, and faith in the supreme commander's judgment. Paulus was the ideal product of that system. He followed orders he knew were wrong, because following orders was what he had been trained to do his entire career. Individual initiative, tactical flexibility, and independent judgment were subordinated to institutional hierarchy. The hierarchy stated that Hitler commanded. Field marshals and generals obeyed. When that system encountered a situation where obedience meant annihilation, it could not adapt. The officers who argued for breakout were correct. Immediate withdrawal on November 22nd or 23rd would have been costly but feasible. 6th Army could have extracted most of its forces before Soviet encirclement solidified. Equipment would have been lost. Casualties would have been significant, but the army would have survived as a fighting force. Instead, it remained in position and died slowly over 10 weeks. Not because the tactical situation required it, not because military necessity demanded it, but because the order was given and the system that controlled German military operations did not permit questioning that order. Historians have analyzed this decision extensively. Some argue Paulus should have disobeyed Hitler and accepted the consequences. Others note that disobedience would have resulted in immediate replacement and probably would not have saved the army. Some argue the decision to stand fast was correct in strategic terms, tying down Soviet forces that would otherwise have been deployed elsewhere. Others argue this benefit did not justify the destruction of an entire army. What remains undisputed is that everyone involved knew the order was wrong. Paulus knew. His corps commanders knew. Manstein knew. Even Hitler's own staff expressed doubts about the feasibility of holding Stalingrad while surrounded. But knowledge of error does not guarantee the correction of error. Systems designed to prevent independent action prevent it even when independent action is necessary for survival. The stand-fast order at Stalingrad demonstrated a fundamental problem in military command. Orders flow down through hierarchy. Information flows up. But when information reaching the top does not change the orders being issued, the system stops functioning as a feedback mechanism and becomes a one-way transmission of directives that may no longer correspond to reality. 6th Army at Stalingrad received orders based on assumptions that were incorrect. Those assumptions were not revised when subordinate commanders reported facts that contradicted them. The orders remained in effect because changing them would have required acknowledging that they had been wrong from the beginning. The system that issued the orders could not admit error without undermining its own authority. So the orders stood, and the army that followed them ceased to exist. These decisions are documented, not dramatized. They exist to examine how command systems operate when there is a conflict between obedience and survival, and what the cost is when that conflict cannot be resolved. If you found this analysis valuable, consider that military history offers lessons not only on heroism or strategy, but also on the mechanics of how institutions fail. These failures are instructive not because they are unusual, but because they reveal ordinary processes that lead to catastrophic consequences. Don't forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and commenting.